Hello, everybody. Welcome to this module. I'm going to be talking about feasibility and pilot testing, commonly called FMP testing. And my name is Simon Bacon. I'm a professor at Concordia University and co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Center. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that where I work, Concordia University and the CIUS Nord-Île de Montréal, are dependent upon traditional indigenous lands, which provides the physical space and sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Specifically, I'm based at the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, which is recognized as the custodians of this land, and I physically in Tiohtià:ke, which is which is commonly known as Montreal. I think it's important to highlight that that the capacity for us to be on these lands is directly related to policies of expulsion and assimilation of indigenous people during times of settlement and confederation. But also as well, these policies, the impacts of these policies are still being felt at this moment in time. As such, I think it's critically important for all of us to think long and hard about how we can amplify the voices of indigenous people and constantly work against the historic elements of white supremacy and colonialism that still impact us today. And I'm very proud to say that CBITN is actively engaging in a number of different ways to try and readdress that balance. Before I start again, this is just my disclosures, none of which are related to this particular talk. I'd like to highlight the fact that CBITN is a consortium of a number of different partners, and through all of the amazing work of the multitude of different groups that are involved, and with a special thank you to the funding from CIHR, we're able to do the things that we do, deliver the training that we are delivering. And of course, this module was part of that as well. So for today's session, what I'm really these are my key objectives. I want to contrast feasibility and pilot studies. I think there's a lot of confusion about what they are and what the difference is between them. Highlight some of the gaps in the knowledge around feasibility and pilot studies, and then talk a little bit about reporting feasibility and pilot studies. Now, firstly, I'm just going to flag this paper here, which you should be able to access through the portal. If not, you've got the reference here. If you want to pause right now to go away and read this, I thoroughly recommend doing it. This is something it was published a few years ago, 10 years ago now, that's looking at something called a pilot randomized controlled trial. So what I really want you to do is read through this paper and reflect upon it, thinking about what positives and negatives that you can actually highlight from within this paper. As I say, I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, but before we start, it's good to do this exercise. As I say, you can pause the video, go off and do this and come back, just write down a few notes. And we'll see how your perspective may have changed from the start of this presentation to the end of this presentation. So I'm going to start with the very simple basics of all of this. What is feasibility? Fundamentally, feasibility is, can a trial be successfully conducted? That's it. That is what the whole purpose of feasibility is to really get to this issue of whether a trial can be conducted or not. The reason why this becomes critically important is that if you don't go through the steps of really identifying and exploring the issues that may impact the actual conduct of the trial, if you get to the end of your study and, for example, it's a null result, or even it's a positive result, you're not 100% sure whether you've actually got a full evaluation of the hypothesis, or whether this is just a failure of the methodology. This is more often true in null trials than in positive trials. So that's, what you want to try and do is eliminate the mechanical pieces of the study being the things that limit the capacity to really address the key question that you're trying to explore. Very important is that this is not something that supports an investigator's hopes or hypotheses. I think oftentimes we get really caught, especially in the behavioral sciences, around our belief that certain interventions are valuable, worthy, and so on. Exercise is fantastic. Everybody should be doing exercise. Therefore, it's the cure-all for everything. That's our hopes that oftentimes drive our desire to do the research, but it shouldn't be linked directly to the study that we do. The other thing that's important, a feasibility study, is not really testing hypotheses. And I'm going to come back to this with more detail and rationales to why that is so important. But this is not fundamentally a study that addresses questions of hypothesis. Remember, this is a series of studies that really answer the question about the successful conduct of a trial. So let's start with what's the difference between a feasibility study and a pilot study. So a feasibility study provides information about if a proposed trial can be done, should be done, and if so, how. That's it. That's what you're trying to develop. You're trying to answer, sorry, when you deliver a feasibility study. Can I do my final trial? Should I do my final trial, and if so, how? A pilot study is actually a very specific subcomponent of feasibility studies. It's really the mini-me of a trial. So this is where people start to get a little confused, because a pilot study is a feasibility study, but it's a very specific kind of a feasibility study that really mirrors the full-scale trial, but delivering on a much smaller scale. And primarily, as I'll talk about in a little bit, it's really testing aspects of randomization. That's really the key difference that separates pilot studies from the general feasibility study pool. So obviously, this is not a new area. People have been doing research in this for a while. I love this particular study because we see lots of people publish feasibility, more people publish feasibility and pilot studies these days. And Lehana Thavain from McMaster University did a really nice follow-up to people that had published feasibility and pilot studies, and so effectively asked them, what was the reason for doing that study? Okay. And here are I'm giving you the top 3 reasons why people said they were doing a feasibility and pilot study. So the first was we're a small single center study. We don't have the resources for a large multi-center study. Therefore, we did a feasibility and pilot study. Second one, someone else did a study of a similar size, and so we did the same thing. And in fact, they used 6 and we used 12. Fabulous. We were even better than they were. So that's a justification for doing feasibility and pilot study. Another one is we did a similar one before and it was published, therefore we did this one again. So this idea that someone's done it before, therefore it's okay for me to do it this way now. And the third most popular one, the study was being done by a student or interns, limited funds. So capacity was not there to be able to do a full-scale study. Therefore, the study was done and then it was packaged. And all of these really are, as I'm going to show you, not really feasibility and pilot studies, but these are all the justifications, the little sort of mental gymnastics we go through about trying to justify why we've done this small-scale study, rather than actually trying to address the key question that feasibility and pilot studies actually address. So fundamentally, what is the purpose of this feasibility study? Once again, it's really there to answer a specific question about the conduct of a future trial. So this is fundamental. So any feasibility study has to be ultimately tied to a future trial that you intend to deliver. What it is not is a standalone study. Feasibility and pilot study just doesn't live in a vacuum. Okay, it is there to serve a different purpose. It's there to serve the purpose of understanding what to do next. If I come back to this beautiful orbit IBTN model, and of course there are many different models out there in terms of how you go about creating and testing behavior change interventions, but this is the one that we default to. As you can see in this whole step process, that feasibility study pilot trial piece is just along the path to an efficacy trial. It is in a developmental aspect. It is not something that lives unto itself. So, you know, if it's there to actually answer specific questions about a future trial, logically the question becomes, well, what can it actually answer? You know, what should I be using a feasibility study to do? And effectively, there's sort of four areas that really can be addressed with a feasibility study. The first is around process. The other is resources, management, and treatments. So I'm going to break these down so you can kind of see what aspects you should be looking at when you're running a feasibility study. So process is probably the most common reason why most people run a feasibility study. And this is really, you know, talking about the mechanics of what needs to happen to make sure that a full trial could go ahead. And things such as recruitment rate, which is probably the main reason why people do feasibility studies, is number one on that list. But other things around, you know, do I actually have enough people that are eligible to participate? Do I have enough people to be willing to participate? Even some aspects of just delivering the protocol. Can I run through the protocol? Can I hand the protocol off to someone else and can they run through it? And then issues around dropout rates and the like. So these are process components, and all of these are totally acceptable things to measure in the feasibility study, and these are probably the most common ones. Resources, this is probably one where we don't spend enough time doing. So this is really, you know, assessing how long are things going to take? Can I actually access the pieces of equipment that I need, and so on. So, you know, within the behavioral sciences, we like to capture lots and lots of information all the time. So, you know, I'm sure all of us have developed questionnaire packages that probably take somewhere in an hour to complete. So, you know, fundamental question in a large scale trial, or even in a small scale trial, an efficacy trial, will people complete that stuff? How important is that information? You know, these are fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself when you're capturing this. And how much are you willing to sacrifice the capacity for people to go all the way through the project for those extra pieces? You know, understanding what is that optimal length that doesn't impact the actual delivery of the trial. Issues around access to testing and intervention equipment. You know, we've done studies with that have had notable imaging components to them, and access to imaging equipment is not that straightforward. This actually then creates, you know, potential problems in terms of, can we recruit and test people not because of their lack of willingness, but our actual access to that piece of equipment. Understanding the kind of staff that you need, the skill sets of the staff. If you're going to do something multi-center, you know, understanding the capacity for other sites to deliver this. For our interventions, oftentimes, if they're in person, you know, having the interventionists that are available is quite often problematic. On the management side, this is really about, you know, understanding the human and data management issues that might come out. So scheduling. Scheduling is a pain. It's always a pain. Oftentimes, if you don't control all of the facilities that you're using, you know, being able to identify who is a key person, being able to actually book appointments to things like imaging equipment becomes really problematic, can become problematic. If you plan to do a large scale trial that has multiple sites and you may onboard new sites, how do you go about doing that? If you've got multiple components where data is being captured, how can you make sure that that data is flowing safely and being stored and captured appropriately? Oftentimes there's a sort of bidirectional process, et cetera, et cetera. So a feasibility study can get to some of those issues. And then finally, there's issues around questions of the feasibility of the treatment and comparator, and that's really important. Consider the comparator piece as well. Now, this once again is not questions of does this work. This is really about the ability to deliver these interventions. So the capacity of the interventionist, patient acceptability of study arms, patient adherence to study arms, the capacity to monitor safety in study arms, for example. So these are really sort of key things that, if you think about it, if you stop and just go through that list of things, a lot of the times we just assume these things to be not a problem. And then we step into trials without really completely understanding them. And we start doing this, and then we start running into problems with recruitment. We start running into problems of patients and individuals crossing over from comparator to treatment, etc. We can't access certain equipment. This then threatens the delivery of that trial that you're doing. And so that then may lead to lower recruitment numbers, and then a potential for an underpowered study, which then threatens the capacity to evaluate efficacy. So feasibility is all about trying to understand that. So what should be the primary outcomes of a feasibility study? Okay, so we've got three potential options. Could be the primary outcome for the main trial. So you could get an estimate of the potential effect size. Obviously, you're not going to get the efficacy data. That's not the point here, but maybe this is what you build a trial up to. Maybe you pick a surrogate. Sometimes the main trial primary outcome is too complicated. It's too difficult to get that. And in a feasibility and pilot study, which by definition are going to be smaller scale, that may not be appropriate. So a surrogate might be a reasonable proxy that you incorporate in there. And that would certainly give you some sort of evidence around whether the intervention will work or not. Or C, could it be something else? So I will give you a moment just to reflect on these and think about which answer that you're going to pick. And whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to briefly mention surrogate endpoints. This is just a bit of a sidebar slide that is kind of interesting. I love this study. It's a fantastic study, published in 2017. What this study did was look at all the cardiovascular trials over a 20-year period that use surrogate endpoints, with the idea that they were doing the surrogate endpoint study that then would move on to full-scale trials. And New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and Lancet. So, these aren't, negligible studies that we're talking about here. We're sort of talking about studies in some of the biggest journals in medicine. Across that period, there were 220 cardiovascular trials that had surrogate endpoints. Remember, any kind of surrogate study is really just some form of intermediary efficacy study leading to a full-scale study that looks at a primary outcome. So what happened? So interestingly, 220 of those 220, 157 were positive for the primary surrogate endpoint. So that's kind of showing, on the face of it, that this is valuable and we should move forward. Of those, only 44 followed up with a full clinical trial. So that, leaves quite a few that didn't. And then interestingly, about 50% of those had a positive result, and about 50% had a negative result. So very important here, just if you're going to use surrogate markers, even if you get a positive outcome from a positive surrogate study, doesn't guarantee that that's going to end up leading to a full-scale trial that has a primary outcome being successful. Of course, what's also important to highlight here is the significant proportion of studies, over 100 studies, that had the positive outcome sort of just stopped at that point. So we don't really know, and problem is that people take that as, you know, preliminary evidence to say that intervention X works, but actually in reality we have no idea, as evidenced by the 44 that didn't. On the other side of things, obviously we had 63 studies that were negative, 157 were positive. Of those, 48 were not followed. So unsurprisingly, people sort of gave up at that point in time. And then 15, which proportionally is not that different when you actually look at it in terms of the 163, moved on to a full clinical trial. And 3 of those 15, so unsurprising, a much smaller percentage, a lot less than 50%, were actually positive. So this means that you have to be really careful, because you don't know at any point in time, just because you're using a surrogate measure, that this actually will translate to positive outcomes. So this is just a sidebar warning about using surrogate measures as a proxy for outcome trials. So clearly the answer should probably not be B. So what should be the main outcomes? Quite simply, there's 4 outcomes. First is continue without modifications. So for feasibility and pilot studies, you really need to develop a whole series of criteria that give you go and no-go levels. And it's somewhere that sits between that go and no-go. You could have this caution moment as well, which kind of says it's close enough to go, but not quite there, but not as bad as no-go. But ideally, you've got a go, no-go kind of criteria. If you meet all of your go criteria, that's a great signal to say that you have the capacity to deliver the full trial. Other options are continue without modifications, but monitor closely. So this is when you start getting to the cautious range. So you kind of didn't quite meet the go criteria, but you weren't far off, and you kind of understand why you might not have met it. And so but you feel confident that in a full-scale trial, those will not be huge barriers, and that there's probably a small, minor tweaking that'll get you there. The third is continue, but modify the protocol. So here you probably were still in that close to go, but you understand why you didn't get there, but you actually need to shift something quite important. So whether it be the nature of the things that you're assessing, maybe you thought you would do MRIs and you just don't have access to MRIs, but there's a different measure that will capture the intermediary piece that you want to know. And then importantly is this final piece, which is clearly a stop. One of the things I think we're very allergic to is our studies not working. So we have this preoccupation with just forging ahead no matter what. And clearly, we should be a lot more critical of the quality of the work, ensuring that when things don't go well, that we just stop doing things. Trial and error is a fundamentally important piece of science. So for as many times as, I can think of in my career, as many times as I've had good positive results, we've probably had twice as many failures. And those failures have gone along the way for us to be able to get to the positive outcomes. If you do the feasibility study and you meet none of your, or very few of your go, no-go criteria, that means that your study, when you deliver it in a full-scale trial, is probably not going to functionally work. If it functionally doesn't work, and that then threatens your capacity to deliver the trial, it increases the probability that if you forge ahead, your trial will fail. And the knock-on effect of that is then people start to associate that failed trial with the failure of the hypothesis rather than the methodological limitations. And you could kill an entire line of research. People aren't very keen to go down lines of research that generally don't seem to be working, not because it's not a good idea, not because the hypothesis isn't good. It's just because methodologically it's not solid. And so there's an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, I have the right question, I just don't have the right methodology, and then rework the methodology to a point where you can actually deliver on the trial. So all feasibility and pilot studies really have these four outcomes that you can end with. There is nothing else. Now, just coming back to the pilot studies, so what makes pilot studies unique compared to general feasibility studies? As I mentioned before, this is really testing aspects specific to randomization. Okay, so this is identifying people's willingness to participate in comparison groups, unintended crossovers between arms, adherence and dropouts across both arms as well. Most of the time here, if you're interested in testing an active intervention group, most people who are signing up to your study are probably interested in participating in that. And oftentimes when they get randomized to the comparison group, they are less happy about that option. And that can have serious consequences depending on the nature of what the comparison is, and so on. So, a lot of times really pilot studies, and we don't really think about it this way, but pilot studies are really fundamentally there testing issues more about the comparison group than they are necessarily about the actual intervention group. Very, very important. Once again, pilot studies are just smaller versions of the final trial. So they're asking questions about delivery of the final trial. They are not a less rigorous efficacy trial. That's fundamentally important. Okay, so pilot studies are definitely not a less expensive way to assess efficacy. They are also not a guarantee that a full study will be successful or positive. Okay, so oftentimes, this is a quote that comes from Ken Friedland, who at the time was the editor-in-chief of Health Psychology. It would drive him nuts the amount of times that he would see people publish or try and publish papers, pilot studies that had tested efficacy and would have this line in it, that this study has preliminary evidence of efficacy. This is not a study that can tell you about efficacy. It cannot even really tell you much about an effect size estimate for the full study, which is another reason why oftentimes I hear people say, well, I'm doing a pilot study because I need to understand what my sample size should be for my full study. And so this is a huge fallacy that I'm actually going to just pull apart a little bit in the next slide or two, because I think this is one of the areas where the classic line, lies, damn lies, and statistics comes to the fore more than any other time. So let's get into it. Pilot studies and sample size. So I'm going to take a step back and think about statistical analysis. So we have really two components of statistical analyses: inferential statistics. This is really, making inferences and predictions about population based on a sample of data taken from the population in question. Okay, so the whole point of inferential statistics, and this is part of random samples, how well can this replicate onto a larger sample? And descriptive statistics, which really just tell us about, the nature of what we're seeing. Doesn't really tell us anything more than that. Okay, so it's just a way of summarizing information. Now, from inferential statistics, one of the key components is the idea of standard error. Okay, and in true random samples, the standard error should map quite nicely onto the real population. But of course, what we know is that the smaller the sample size, the larger the standard error starts to become. So if we just think about a pilot study being a small sub-study of the main trial, because that's effectively what a pilot study is, right? It's a mini-me of a larger trial. Okay. Automatically, the true point estimate in a full-scale trial will have a small, in theory, standard error around it. In our pilot study, even if we have the same point estimate, our standard error is going to be much larger. Okay, so that's just basics: smaller study, larger error. We also know that actually in reality, truth of any point estimate sits somewhere within the standard error. That's the basis of inferential statistics, right? Is the probability is greater that it's in the middle, but it actually could sit anywhere across that spectrum. So we have a pilot study, smaller sample size, much larger standard error. That may or may not translate directly to where the mean effect would be, right, the point estimate in the full-scale trial. We don't know where on that continuum that's going to translate to. Of course, if we do a pilot study and we use the average, so if we use the point estimate from that pilot study, but that point estimate sits on the lower end of the spectrum, doesn't map directly, whatever sample size calculation we do is almost going to be related to an absolute futility process, because the sample size will be so large to actually get the real result that will, we'll never get there. So, and we've seen this in a number of times with even with pharmacological studies, right, where studies have to be aborted just for futility purposes. Of course, if our pilot study is on the higher end of the standard error for the main trial, it means we're underpowered, right? We will miss our window. So when we get to the main study, we won't have enough participants in there if we are basing our sample size calculations on the point estimate from the pilot study. That's really difficult to sort of wrap our heads around a little bit, I know, because we're talking about wide spectrums across two different studies. I'm going to have an example that sort of puts that in context of what that looks like in reality. What's probably more effective if you really, this is just really for sample size calculations, period. This is not specific to pilot studies. This is obviously a main efficacy studies. Really what you want to be targeting is changes, minimally clinically important differences. So changes that are going to get you to a clinically significant threshold, right? So can I shift my key outcome enough to make it actually clinically worthwhile? What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through an example of a study that we ran, and this was an early phase study called X-asthma. And very simply, we took patients who were sedentary and had asthma, and we gave them a 12-week supervised supervised aerobic exercise program, which is sort of a standard 3 times a week for 1 hour. And the reason we did this and why this was really a feasibility study is for those that know anybody that has asthma, the rhetoric historically has always been, don't exercise, it's going to exacerbate your asthma, it's a bad thing. Lots of school kids used to be taken out of gym class, for example, if they had asthma because the teachers were worried that they would have an asthma attack, et cetera, et cetera. Now, our understanding of the science has evolved quite a lot. This study is about 15 years old, so it was one's still early in the days where there's big question marks over exercise and asthma. Now we've pretty much debunked all of that. But we weren't sure that people would sign up to this. We weren't sure that there would be interest, etc. So we did this very, very small scale feasibility study. And the 2 measures that we were interested in, we were really interested in, would people come and do it? How much would they actually adhere to this? Would the setting work, etc., etc. We threw in there the ACQ and the AQLQ. So this is asthma control questionnaire and asthma quality of life questionnaire. And these are 2 very, very important clinical measures that you have. And this was just part of our, feasibility packaging, etc. When we did our feasibility study, these were the results we got. So just to say 1 on the ACQ, if you've got a score over 1, that indicates poor control of asthma. So this is very problematic. So this is, you've got lots of symptoms a lot of the time. So our baseline was 2.4. So that's a huge a huge amount of hugely problematic control. That's what happened to pre. At post, on average, it was 0.67. So we had dropped by about 1.75 units, and we were below on average the threshold for ACQ. On the flip side, asthma quality of life. So hilariously, these were created by the same person, and they decided to do one, higher is worse. Quality of life, higher is better. So pre to post, an increase there was really quite impressive. But as you'll see, there's only 4 people in this. Okay, so it was a really small scale. We were just, tinkering here. But a change of 1.22, which is actually really quite large. Not statistically significant, but on average, that's a pretty big movement. So so these are what we found. So this is the mean and the standard deviation. But clearly, there's no control group. So this then flags, well, what would the control group do? It's, just by recruiting people, are they going to get better? Sometimes can happen. And just to put this in context, that the MCID for ACQ and AQLQ is 0.5, right? So 1.75, 1.22 is huge. I mean, this is like knock it out the ballpark kind of stuff. I mean, we did the study, we measured those, and we're like, yeah, we don't believe it. I mean, it's just impossible. That's just a level of change that would never in a million years seem feasible, realistic. But that's what we found. So what happens if you take this data and then actually put this into a sample size estimate for a whole trial, right? Because that's what people sometimes do. They will do, hey, let's do the feasibility study, let's do the pilot study, let's get the data and let's use it. So if you use the raw data from the feasibility study, so a change score of 1.75, standard deviation 0.69, the total number of participants we would need for a full-scale trial would be 4. AQLQ, if you ran the same numbers, it would be 28. Which just on the face of it makes no sense whatsoever. Now, the good news is, as I say, we've got this minimally clinically important difference. And so, if you put that in, suddenly the numbers go to 60 and 160. But interestingly, these standard deviations are obviously very, very large because we're taking a population of 4 people, right? So that's not not a representative population. And thankfully, what we had was some epidemiological data, which sort of gave us some general standard deviation data in the population. So actually what we did was when we actually did this as a full trial, when we did the full trial, we built our sample size estimate. We didn't even use any of the feasibility data. We took the MCID, which is 0.5, and then we took our epidemiological data, for which was 0.86 for the ACQ and 0.91 for the AQLQ, and actually did our power calculation based on that. Because we knew that that was the clinically important level, and this was a much better representation of how these 2 measures vary in a population of patients with asthma. So what did the full trial do? So unsurprisingly, this is the control group, and what you see here is there's actually a change. This was actually a significant change. It's only 0.2, but that 0.2 is quite a bit in the context of a 0.5 clinically significant difference. So lo and behold, doing, these individuals had nothing. We didn't give them any intervention whatsoever. There was an improvement. And then this was our exercise group, and we did not get a 1.75 change in the exercise group, as you would probably expect. When you do adjusted and unadjusted, difference between the 2 arms is around about 0.5, and it was statistically significant. So this is a good example of, if you're not careful and if you just take data from pilot studies or feasibility studies to use samples to generate sample sizes, you could be really, really off in a many different ways. If we'd have taken the averages, we'd have been underpowered. If we'd have taken the standard deviations, we would have been overpowered. A few other things, just thinking about this issue of sample as well. Oftentimes I've seen people do pilot studies in a sample that isn't actually representative of the sample they end up doing a large full-scale trial on. So that obviously is not, doesn't make sense. But it does come down to another question of, well, if I'm going to do a pilot study, so I need to understand, do my processes work? How many is enough? And that is a really tough question to ask. Thankfully, someone a lot smarter than me did a wonderful simulation study, and they've got some answers that we can at least guide around. So as it turns out, if you have a continuous outcome, and then you plot this curve, which is the sample size by incremental gain in precision, what you find is that a good pilot study sample size, where the so this is where the inflection point is on that curve, is about 70, so 35 per group if it's a 2-arm study. If it's a binary outcome, the window is a bit bigger, so anywhere between 60 and 100 per arm, and that's that's because of the way that there's less precision in a binary outcome. So probably around 120 if your binary outcome if your outcome is binary. So these just give you a guide as to why you would set up a certain size, and this allows you to be able to explore lots of aspects around the randomization as well as some of the other elements of feasibility. Last few slides. So pilot studies, because they're often underpowered, can only be really used to generate beliefs that there will be a trend towards significance to provide support for a larger study. If you happen to measure your outcome in the pilot study, okay, and it is significant, it doesn't guarantee that the full trial will be significant. And it also doesn't negate the fact that you still need to do the full trial, okay? It's really important. Just very briefly, the key element here is about issues of equipoise. So this is the fundamental underpinning of the ethical foundations of trials. There has to be real, meaningful uncertainty about the result. The problem is that if you do a small pilot efficacy trial, which is an oxymoron, you start to eat away at things around, the credibility and plausibility. And what that means in terms of translation across clinical meaningfulness, clinically meaningful impact. So trying to subscribe or extract any kind of efficacy data out of the pilot study is hugely problematic for a number of reasons. Just going to talk briefly, of course, the issue then starts to become, if I do a feasibility and pilot study, questions of publication. So this is now getting to this reporting issue. So the third point in the outcomes. And here's the paradox, right? So who are the outcomes for? Well, they're really for the research team and the funding bodies, right? I'm doing a feasibility study to really demonstrate that I can do a full-scale trial. So the results affect me, and the funding bodies who I'm hoping are going to fund the full trial. They tell us about the conduct of a specific trial. These are not generic things. And they're not generalizable, right? So this is really interesting to me in my setting. So does it make these easy to publish? Well, conceptually, no. Who wants to know about my ability to conduct my large-scale trial? But then also, yes, because there's a lot of things that we can actually learn about how we do things that may actually be interesting to other people when they're starting to do their studies. So some of the things we learn about doing what to do and what not to do sometimes can translate across to other settings. If nothing else, it gives other settings an opportunity to explore these fundamental questions to be able to see what they should and shouldn't be doing. The good news is that in the last 15 years, there's been a huge acceleration in our conceptualization around pilot feasibility studies. So there is a consult guideline out there. I will highlight it. It's for randomized pilot and feasibility studies. And I will say that not all feasibility studies need to be randomized. What's unique about this is issues around, identifying consenting in the context of a pilot feasibility study, the idea of having go, no-go criteria, the sample size, unintended consequences or harms, something we don't report enough of, and then translating what you've learned to your actual definitive RCT. So these are the kind of elements that really should be driving the process. So therefore should be the things that you actually report in if you do want to publish. And the fact that we have a consult guideline also helps with publishing it as well, because it sort of says, here's a set of, these papers are important and here's why they're important. And if you just demonstrate the importance of them, then that helps. And then also at the same time, the same group that actually published the consult created the pilot and feasibility studies journal. So you have a journal specifically dedicated to publishing these kind of studies. Important to note, this is not, I wanted to do an efficacy study, but I didn't have enough juice in the tank for whatever resources, etc. So I did a small scale one, and now I'm going to fob it off as a pilot study. They see through that straight away. This is real setting up proper pilot feasibility studies that they're interested in publishing. So moving into the future, where are our great challenges? The first is around nomenclature. Lots of us talking about pilot and feasibility studies. We're talking about them in very different ways. We're not really doing this in a consistent way. Literally last month, I was in a meeting with some of my clinical colleagues who were having a very hard time understanding the difference between efficacy, pilot, and feasibility, and completely mishmashing all of them. So this is still a very, very common issue that we have to tackle. I think there's a huge amount of education that's needed for grant reviewers and funding agencies about the value of pilot and feasibility studies. I think we're starting to see more and more inroads into this area where, when put in the context of a final study, a final RCT, an important clinical question, and positioning in where the evidence has got to and why we need this to be able to be successful on the other side of it, these kind of studies getting funded a little bit more frequently, but it's still not frequent enough. And that is, making sure that we're positioning these in that context that actually makes the difference. I think there's this still question about how big should a feasibility and pilot study be. These sample size issues will rage on for a long time. I don't think anybody has definitive answers. I don't feel like I have a definitive answer other than to say that I would never base a full scale trial sample size estimate on a feasibility and pilot, but how big should a feasibility and pilot study be? Especially when we've got no-go criteria, how do you define, the parameters around that? Very difficult to identify. We're starting to see the development of new trial designs as we've gotten more sophisticated. So we have these things called like Vanguard trials, where we sort of start in a pilot mode. And then if we get the right signals, we can ramp this up to a full-scale trial. So the inclusion of that pilot phase into the full-scale trial, we still don't have very clear, guidelines around how that should be done and what some of the parameters around what gets included and what doesn't get included. So that's still hugely challenging in that area. And then talking of the evolution of trial designs, adaptive trials, adaptive platform trials are now becoming something that we're exploring more and more. So this is where you kind of start down a path and you have the opportunity to add arms and remove arms and sort of create an infrastructure where you don't necessarily lose a lot of your historic data, and you can keep comparing new innovations with existing gold standards in a more efficient way. How piloting segues into those adaptive trial designs is still not 100% settled. There's no definitive, this is how you do it. Obviously, having an a priori process is critical, but what that process is, I think, is still up in the air. So these areas where we've got real opportunities to move on and expand the role of feasibility in pilot studies. Feasibility data help to prevent, but don't necessarily eliminate, foreseeable problems in the conduct of a full trial. I think this is really important to remind you as well. Just because you did a pilot or a feasibility study and it worked well, or it worked enough and you managed to work, you think you've understood the kinks, when you get to the full trial, you can never guarantee what's going to happen. Think of all those people that had done all the diligent work and they'd got up to their full trial. They launched their full trial in 2018. It was going to go for 4 years to 2022. They would have their data. Boom, COVID hits in the middle, kind of blows the whole thing out the water. That's an extreme, but it just, it goes to show that you can never quite be 100% sure whenever you start a trial, even if you've got all of the pieces that you've worked out, that it's always going to work out 100%. That being said, not doing any of the precursor work is most often than not a recipe for disaster when you get to the full trial. If you don't do that pre-work, I can almost guarantee that you're going to run into multiple problems in the full trial. Okay, so doing the work is really important. So to end where we started, come back to this particular paper for which you obviously went off and did some work around this. Now it's time to pull out your notes about what you saw as positive and negative. So on the positive side, it was a pilot study in terms of they assessed recruitment, retention, and usage. They looked at acceptability of randomization, satisfaction. They were able to deliver evaluations at 6 weeks and 6 months. And they had some comparisons going on. The negative really comes down to this: how do we move forward from this, right? What was acceptable and feasible? What was the go, no-go criteria? This issue of anthropometrics as a secondary outcome, getting back to this effect size, so falling into those classic traps of, I've got my data and this is my driver, sample size, etc. They also, didn't really talk very much about BCTs, the structure of their intervention, what were the fundamental components, or the behaviors that they were actually targeting. So it was all this secondary outcome piece, but did they actually manage to impact the behaviors that they were targeting with their intervention? That wasn't reported. So this is a really good example where there's a number of really nice parts in it, but also a whole bunch of pieces that sort of fallen through the crack, and that, could have done better. Of course, there's no perfect study, but, I think what we need to do is strive closer towards having more inclusive information when we do these kind of studies. Finally, my acknowledgements here. This is the MBMC team, and I just got to acknowledge the great people I work with. For this kind of particular work, Kim Lavoie, who's the co-director of the MBMC with me, Linda Powell and Ken Friedland, who I've mentioned a few times within this talk, have been absolutely the front cutting edge of this work. The staff and students, which are led amazingly by Guillaume Lacoste and Jen Schepenik. A big shout out to Natalie Marin, who coordinates all the things that I tend to do at the MBMC, and then our funders within the MBMC. So FRQS, CIHR particularly, and the institutions that help make the MBMC possible. Thank you.